Thank you.
I do my job.
You know what, Matt?
So how do you watch how?
Is there a glare?
Remember I showed you that? She designed
Does that help at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit.
And then can you see Allie? Yeah.
Yes.
Where we go.
You see the courtyard in that screen.
The tree from the very steep.
Dave, you see the courtyard in the screen.
Okay, David. Sorry, not sure. These blinds do not pull shut.
I feel like something's missing if you don't have it on
You
your
don't.
list. Do you have a charger?
You are getting late.
You okay?
Well, it's not in one at a time, so switch it over.
Here, I
Oh, you do? And how do you get it as Oh, wow.
I still have to check in.
I know, it's all gonna go back to you. Oh, it's okay. It's gonna go back to you for the next one. I'm so good.
There we go.
Sorry.
It's HDMI, so. And I'm not. Yes.
Drag them.
Yeah, the things are broken,
Hi,
I think.
everyone.
They are.
We'll go ahead and come together. Thanks for coming for the educational hour where we'll have a chance to kind of pick up where the sermon left off. So I'm excited to have a chance to talk more and hopefully hear your thoughts and questions too. I'm not going to do an introduction because I think we introduced me already. I do want to acknowledge two very special colleagues of mine, Jen G., who you all know here at Calvary.
Hey, Jen.
And yes, Jen G., Justice Revival's Board Chair and my co-conspirator from the very beginning of this ministry. So she's implicated in all of this. And I want to introduce Lori Adams Brown and her husband Jason. Lori is a fellow board colleague as well, and they're up from the South Bay. It's great to see you guys. Thanks for making the trip. So we're going to pick up where we left off, and I have a session that talks in a little more depth about the ERA, different components. I'll give you sort of a roadmap of where I'm heading, and like I say, we'll want to make it interactive too, because you're hearing a lot from me, and I'd also love to hear from you. There's a table with more information on Justice Revival over there, and if you haven't already signed up, if you're not already connected with us, I'll just pass this around in case you want to sign up and stay that way. Hello, I'm good to see you. So you heard me in this sermon reference the Equal Rights Amendment, start to introduce it. You may already know a good bit about it, and we can go into more depth. This is just one introductory slide about me. Something I didn't take time for in the sermon was to say that I've actually lived and worked in places where levirate marriage is still practiced, and it still doesn't work, and it's still really harmful and degrading, and that's part of why I think it's important to name that and to recognize why it's problematic. So I started my career in human rights when I left from Calvary, which was such an important part of my journey. This was really a place where I had a chance to do a lot of exploration, think about what God might be calling me to do, and received a lot of just love and encouragement from friends here. So Calvary launched me halfway around the world to sub-Saharan Africa, and that's where you see me in South Sudan here, worked on different human rights issues over the years throughout that region before coming back to the United States. And the other point I wanted to make here is that the work that I had a chance to do to help widows and orphans overseas, it was always work to assert their human rights, and those are rights that are agreed upon in a series of international treaties, and before that, a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which you might be familiar with. And those standards have influenced many national constitutions around the world, but our Constitution, as you know, predates that modern human rights movement. And hence, we're still working to reform, to bring the US Constitution into alignment with this core principle of equality and non-discrimination, which is very well accepted and the subject of broad consensus, but still we labor here to include it in our own Constitution. And then, of course, the Constitution affects what laws can be passed, how laws are interpreted, and so on. Here's a brief roadmap of what I had planned, what we can talk about today with regard to the ERA. There's one more. So we can talk more about understanding what the ERA is, what we find in Christian tradition that orients us toward an idea of human equality and human rights. And then we can look at it on a practical level at why the ERA is important, why it's needed, what's the current status, why has there been such opposition, and does that opposition endure? And then what you can do if you're interested in getting involved. So that's the general plan. We may need to emphasize a couple areas in more depth. When you see this, is there any part of it that jumps out to you as what you're most interested in exploring? And feel free to just, name it, shout it out if there is.
What's the status?
The status.
Status.
Okay.
Can the states still ratify it, or is that expired?
Okay, so a number of votes for status, and we'll absolutely talk about that.
Christian view.
The Christian view.
Why in the world is there opposition?
Absolutely.
Amen.
So it sounds like people may be pretty familiar with what it is, and we can get right into what are some of the support in the Christian tradition, and then status and challenges. That's great. Just really briefly, what comes to mind for you when you hear Equal Rights Amendment or ERA? What's like a one-word association that you might have?
Sadly, Phyllis Schlafly.
Schlafly, Phyllis Schlafly, arch opponent of equality.
Women.
Women? Others?
Race.
Equality.
Race.
Race. Interesting. Why race?
Well, I think we went through a whole long period saying that we were giving equal but separate education to black people in this country. And they have the right to learn as we do the same teachers.
Yeah, wanting to bring racial equality into the conversation. That's great. And one other, maybe one more? Fairness. I have asked this question at past workshops, and these are some of the answers that I've gotten. Alan Alda, one of my personal favorites. Equality, don't we already have it? Why isn't it ratified? So an interesting sort of range of impressions that people have. The polling shows that most Americans mistakenly think we do already have the Equal Rights Amendment in our Constitution. And so there's just a great need for increased public awareness about this gap, this deficiency in our system, and what the consequences are. Just to give you the text of the amendment, it's really brief. This is a little bit, no, this is not abridged. This is literally the operative clause. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So direct, straightforward, brief. It's interesting to note that most constitutions around the world have a provision like this. So this graphic reflects a study by the World Policy Analysis Center, and they put countries into 4 categories. The green countries are the vast majority that guarantee constitutional rights regardless of sex or prohibit sex discrimination. So there's an explicit such guarantee. And then, my cheaters. Yeah. So then you've got a few other categories. The United States has an equality guarantee that's not specific to sex. So I mentioned the Equal Protection Clause during the sermon. And you heard maybe a little bit of the story there. The Equal Protection Clause, when it was first adopted in 1868, did not include women. So it was a post-Civil War Reconstruction Amendment to extend citizenship rights to formerly enslaved persons. But when women tried to sue to enforce that right to equal protection, so that they could do things like enter the legal profession or run for office, they lost those lawsuits. So there were clear rulings that women were not included at that time, and it wouldn't be for many decades until the early 70s that the Equal Protection Clause was finally interpreted through this groundbreaking litigation that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a part of, that Pauli Murray had an important role in, that led to extending equal protection to women. So there's the Equal Protection Clause that affords some equality, but there's not a specific provision in the Constitution. And as you heard me say in the sermon, there's not a common standard of equality that applies to all types of discrimination. And then you have a few other categories too. So that's kind of a comparative picture.
What's the dark orange?
Yeah, Saudi Arabia and Australia.
That's no specific provision at all. And then there's a light category that's an aspirational provision, so something that's not binding, more of a goal, but it doesn't have teeth to it. Yeah, it's an interesting picture. I mean, the age of our Constitution is certainly a factor here. But let me back up and just share a few other basics that the ERA would ensure for the first time that women are citizens of equal stature. It carries obviously a permanence and an authority that our statutory laws don't, because it would be authoritative no matter who is in the White House or Congress or who is on the Supreme Court. So it's a provision of both symbolic and practical importance. Symbolic when we think about the role our Constitution plays in reflecting and also shaping our national values, but very practical in that it would empower Congress to legislate on issues of gender-based injustice that are national in scope. So it would provide a constitutional foundation for laws that would enforce that guarantee of equal rights. And then let me just trace the outlines of this status. And there's a lot of history here, but to give you just the outline as we start, the ERA has actually been fully ratified. So it's been adopted by 2/3 of Congress. That happened in the early 1970s. Folks might remember that, or you might just know that. Congress passed it on a bipartisan basis and sent it to the states. And then since that time until today, 38 states have ratified it. That's 3/4 of states, and that's the other requirement for an amendment. Now, there are a couple procedural disputes, and I'll get into that a little more later on. So that's part of the debate over the status. But there are a number of legal experts who affirm that the ERA is effectively, technically valid today and needs only to be recognized. And when I mention legal experts, lawyers in the room, I'm talking about Larry Tribe is one, Russ Feingold is one, Kathleen Sullivan, who was the dean of Stanford, she just testified in front of the Senate that the ERA has met these requirements. It's the only amendment to pass both of those high hurdles of supermajorities in Congress and the states to meet those requirements and not to be recognized. So it's literally hanging at the very last possible step where it's meant to be published by a certain official called the archivist, and it has not been. So that's a little bit of an overview.
Excuse me, what's the archivist or the archivist?
It's the head of the National Archives, where the Constitution is actually held. So it's an executive position appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. They're actually in the process of trying to confirm a new archivist. So traditionally, it's not a political role, it's a ministerial role, and it's an office that's not meant to have discretion to make a judgment call like this. But the archivist office has sort of been caught in the political crossfire, if you will.
Well, has one been named by President Biden?
Yeah, Biden has named a new appointee, and we're waiting for her to be confirmed by the Senate. But that will need. Actually, forget if it's a majority vote or 60, but it'll need Senate support, and so that's where it's stuck right now.
So we need Feinstein back in.
Yeah. We absolutely need Feinstein back for many reasons, but yes, including this and another piece of legislation that I'll mention. Let's see what else is up here. And a majority of Americans do support it, as well as believe that it's already been finalized. I wanted to show you just briefly, this is a quote from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I mentioned. This was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. It's kind of the cornerstone of human rights law and the foundation of the modern human rights movement. And you can see it's talking about everyone being guaranteed their rights without distinction of any kind, and I've emphasized the word sex because they're concerned about racial discrimination, sex discrimination, religious discrimination. So it's one common standard, and this principle has gone on to influence most every constitution that's been adopted since this time. So it's a very authoritative, widely accepted principle in international law that we're seeking to have enshrined into our Constitution. Yes?
Was that provision lobbied for by Eleanor Roosevelt?
That's a great question. I mean, she chaired the commission, as you may know, that drafted the Universal Declaration, and there were 18 countries that participated. So it was a collaborative process. I don't know that she lobbied for it. In fact, I think it was the representative from India who was pretty instrumental in including sex equality there alongside the other categories.
Thank you.
Well, I mentioned Polly Murray during the sermon, who you see up here, and who I was hearing there's a couple, I think, documentaries about her on Netflix. My Name is Polly Murray is one of them. So if you haven't explored her story, it's incredibly inspirational. But she was a civil and human rights advocate before she became an Episcopal priest. And like I mentioned, she's really known for insisting on the intersection of all of our rights, insisting on the importance that racial equality and sex equality both be considered, that each of these movements, the civil rights movement and the women's movement, consider the others. And so she's a singular figure in the struggle for equality. But broadly, when we think about so many Christian leaders who we admire and honor now for their labors for justice, in each case, they were advocating for a disenfranchised, marginalized group of people to be included, to be elevated to a station of greater equality with the majority. So if we think about the arc of history, there were many different movements, whether it's abolition of slavery, whether it's resisting Nazi tyranny during the Second World War, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, but the uniting theme and idea that comes to be included under the umbrella of human rights is that we are all free and equal, and that we are entitled to the same minimum dignity of human rights. And the cause of the ERA is very much a part of that same struggle over time. I already talked a bit about Polly Murray. I won't go into too much detail given the time we have, but again, her autobiography is also deeply inspirational. And it's sort of hard to understate the significance of her legal theory in influencing things like Brown versus Board of Education and the movement for the ERA. Okay, so let's think about what we know in our tradition that relates to the ideal of equality. And again, we started to foreshadow this in the sermon, but I'm just going to share a few core themes from Christian tradition that I think are relevant to any movement for equality. We're all image bearers equally, which gives us all a remarkable, really an infinite human worth that can't be measured and shouldn't be ranked in sort of a hierarchy. We know that our scripture calls us to care about justice just as God cares deeply about justice because of God's concern for us. And again, as I mentioned this morning, there's this special emphasis on justice for any vulnerable group. So that phrase, the widow and the orphan, in the Old Testament, it has particular significance for those specific groups, but it also comes to have a broader meaning. It stands in for any person who's been marginalized and who's been excluded or made vulnerable. Sometimes you hear the prisoner, the orphan, the alien, the poor. These are the particular groups that Scripture is thinking about, considering when thinking about our obligation to do justice. And of course, there's Galatians, the scripture that tells us there is no male or female, Jew or Greek, slave or free, because we are all one in Christ Jesus. And so in one verse, Paul overcomes divisions based on sex or based on race, or perhaps most importantly at that time, based on religious tradition. And then of course there is the testimony, the teaching, the witness of our Savior Jesus, who included everyone at the fellowship table, who scandalized with his association with sinners, with women, with tax collectors. And so the gospel of Christ is extended broadly beyond those who would have felt entitled to it, to everyone in the human community. I have one particular book that I wanted to point out. It's by a scholar named Duncan Forrester, and he has a book-length treatment about this ideal of human equality. It's called On Human Worth, and he really charts the growth of this ideal. He calls it radically egalitarian Christian ideal. He charts that throughout our Christian history, since the Hebrew scriptures down to the present day. And it's a great book, which I recommend highly. And he really is making the argument that there is this central egalitarian theme in the Bible that is competing alongside other themes. So it's always there, and there are people usually on the margins who are always claiming this promise of greater inclusion and equality. But as we know, it takes generation after generation, century after century to make real gains in terms of our social and political environment. And I think that's actually the root question, and it's part of what I was trying to get out of the sermon, is the debate over human worth. Do we understand that as being, oh yes, we're all equal before God in heaven, and that's our hope, so don't worry about our station or place in life, which is an idea that was dominant in the church for many seasons? Or do we understand that because we are all equal in worth before God in heaven, we have an invitation, maybe a mandate to reform our world, to make it more on earth as in heaven, more just, more inclusive, more equal, And all of the social movements we celebrate, say the abolition movement, that's the exact kind of issue that was at play, that the equality, the worth, the salvation would have real world consequences for people who were oppressed and held in bondage. I want to pause here and see if you have, on this point of sort of our Christian ideals in relation to the principle of equality, I want to see if you have additional thoughts on what's meaningful to you in your faith or in Christian tradition that sheds light on this. Yes.
Matthew 25.
Matthew 25. Tell us more.
I was a prisoner and you came to visit me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you gave me clothes. I was an immigrant and you took me in. That's our commandment. So it covers all that. Am I wrong?
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely. Pointing to concern for those who are neglected, those who are suffering without. Yes.
Actually, from that is that compared to the sins of warring and commission, that end with, for both sides, to say we didn't even know it at the time, and it's by all the things of omitting to do that's it may be more important than even some of the things we commit.
Yes. We have sins of omission, and Matthew 25 has really stern words for failing to care for the poor, failing to live into this duty. One more, Jen.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I think it was in Marcy's sermon on Easter, like, one of the things that speaks to me is the first preachers of the gospel were women. So, I mean, Jesus had women as part of his disciples. It's just the patriarchal system de-emphasized all of that over the years. And they were the first ones to carry the word.
Absolutely, which we heard in the Easter story, like you said. Yeah, very important. And in the early church, women played important roles, and the early church was a counter-testimony to Greco-Roman culture that would not have afforded women the same dignity and stature and opportunity to participate as leaders. Okay, and I'll just share this quote by theologian Søren Kierkegaard, who considers neighbor love to point toward equality. And if you know Kierkegaard, you know his writing was also filled with tons of gender bias. So it's a reminder that sometimes the principle is there, but there are blind spots, and we all have blind spots, and there's growth in understanding how to apply the principle coherently and consistently. All right. So I remember that we wanted to talk about the status of the ERA in particular, and remind me, what was the other?
Why there's opposition.
Oh, and why the opposition? Okay, great. Then I'm going to go there with the time we have. There's a section here on some of the reasons the ERA is urgently needed. So I'll just name some of the problems that exist right now that the ERA could very well help us to address in our legal system, just to give you a sense. But let me go to these issues of the current status and why the opposition. So the history of the ERA starts at least 100 years ago with suffragist Alice Paul, right after the 19th Amendment was adopted, giving women the right to vote. She turned her attention to working for equal rights across the board. And I've already mentioned that the ERA was passed by Congress in 1972. At the time, there was something of a timeline or a deadline attached to the amendment, not included within it, but attached to it when it was sent to Congress. And then you saw a lot of states ratify the ERA very quickly. It looked like it would surely pass. But that's when, actually let me back up, that's when the opposition really gained steam in the 1970s, the late 1970s with Phyllis Schlafly, who Jen named, who is an operative on the political right. She had, I think, run for Congress unsuccessfully a couple times.
Good.
And then, I know, then she got involved, but she really made her name by opposing the ERA. And at the time, it was because she was voicing a real attachment to some traditional gender roles, and she wanted to, among other things, but attachment to an idea of women stay at home, men are the ones who work, and she said, we don't want you to take away the benefits and the privileges that women have in this, this system of gender roles. And she was really successful. And she was also like a foreign policy hawk and adopted a lot of other conservative positions, but she effectively slowed down the ratification, and the deadline was extended once, and then it expired in 1982. And a lot of people had the impression that that was the end of the ERA story. But then fast forward to, what was it? I think during the 90s, an amendment gets ratified or finalized over 200 years after it was first introduced. So an amendment that James Madison had first proposed becomes finalized, and people sort of looked up and said, hey, wait, can't we do something about this amendment that, you know, is part of living memory? And so there was a movement that was reignited, and legal scholars looked at it. It's, you know, it's kind of an interesting issue legally because amendments are sort of a rare thing. They don't get done that often. We've only had 27. And each procedure is a bit idiosyncratic. It's not a very clear-cut procedure. And so there was a legal case to be made that this is still viable. And then in 2014, certain states started ratifying it again after many years. The first one to do this was Nevada. And the legislator who led that effort, her name's Pat Spearman, she's actually an ordained minister. And she was the face of reviving the ERA. She is the face of that. And she's a wonderful preacher for this cause too. So Nevada ratified, and then Illinois, and then Virginia, and that made 38 states. So I'm an advocate, right? I'm not an impartial, sort of detached scholar on this issue. I've been in this struggle. Justice Revival has been in this struggle with a lot of other organizations advocating for the ERA to be published. So we've drawn on the opinions of these scholars who say it's possible. We've joined forces with many other organizations. And we've advocated that the ERA should be published now that it's met these requirements. It has not been published, so we're still in that struggle, and that continues. But it really is an historic opportunity. It really is a once-in-a-generation opportunity that we have right now. And there's more support building among lawmakers. So I talked about that really brutal Senate hearing that I sat through in February, there was some more encouraging signs more recently. Some members of the House, led by Cori Bush from Missouri, and who else? Ayanna Pressley. They launched an ERA caucus in the House to elevate the issue, to focus on the importance of the ERA to women of color in particularly, and to try to keep it at the forefront of the agenda. That just happened a few weeks ago. So that was one of the most encouraging developments we've seen, and it got a lot of media attention. And so there is movement, there is interest. There's a whole new generation of folks younger than me who are working on this. I'm laughing because we went out to protest with them. My husband and I went out with these college students, and we shut down Constitution Avenue to demand equality. We shut down the on-ramp to I-395 in the middle of rush hour traffic in Washington, D.C., and made a big ruckus and danced in the street. And the reason I laughed was there were a few of us Gen Xers, and my husband and I both got asked if we were parents. Fair enough, they could be my kids, sure. But I was like, no, I'm just here for fun. So we did that, and but that's important, right? Because there's this idea that the ERA is outdated, outmoded. Opponents certainly want to spin that, but it's very important to young people, and that's a really diverse movement of young people. There are men, there are women, there are people of color, there are LGBT activists, because, I haven't mentioned this, but this is really important. The ERA has tons of potential to protect against discrimination based on sexuality as well as gender. And that's why you see conservative opponents, that's one of their favorite ways to attack the ERA, is to say it would protect rights for trans women. We really want it to protect rights for trans women, for people of all gender identities, people of all identities, period. It's one principle. It's the same strategy that opponents use to continue to try to divide the movement. You guys are hearing from me a whole lot. I want to put up this slide, and this will be the last thing that I share, and then maybe we can have more discussion. Oh, Charlie.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question. You said the archivist might need to interpret it, but is there an anticipation that it will be a lawsuit all the way to the Supreme Court, and they'll have to interpret the timing and whether people can revoke their passage? Certain states, I think, said that it expired. Anyway, I'm curious if that's where you're anticipating this to go.
That's a great question. So there is a lawsuit. There has been one significant lawsuit and a couple smaller ones. And yes, I think whichever way it bounces, it will be litigated.
Okay.
The lawsuit that is pending right now, or there was a ruling in rather, sorry, it's called Illinois versus Fierro, and it was in the DC district and then circuit court. It was the states that recently ratified, they sued the archivist to compel the archivist to publish. And that effort was not successful. But it was sort of a technical opinion in some ways. It wasn't, so it was related to the standard for a mandamus action. It wasn't actually about, is the ERA still valid or viable? And so you've got different constitutional law experts with different opinions on that.
Okay. Yeah, thank
And
you.
also, you mentioned Fierro, was that the vice presidential candidate, Fierro?
Oh, you're thinking of Ferraro.
No. It's a man named David. It looks like Ferriero, but I'm told it's pronounced
sorry.
Fierro. Yeah, no, not the candidate. Okay. Why does the ERA face opposition? Why do we see opposition? I tried to chart the main opposing arguments and my sense of how I would respond. So one of the first arguments is it's not necessary. Equality has been achieved. You've come a long way, baby. Just feel good about that. And we heard that a lot in the Senate hearing, just talking about the real progress that has been made. But in truth, there are still awful statistics on problems like gender-based violence, maternal mortality. In truth, there is a challenge to pass laws on harmful practices like female genital cutting. In truth, there's a real need for this clear constitutional standard. And there's a lot of evidence on this point, I think. The second most popular argument, I would say, is the procedural argument that it's just too late. It's too late. And I think after reading the Bible story we did this morning, it really puts this in perspective. Right? Right? You had 7 years to get this done. And sorry, you missed your chance. The window's closed. It seems like a poor response to the unrequited aspirations of half the country for fundamental dignity and rights. So at the hearing in front of the Senate committee, it was all about the deadline, it was all about the details. But this has never really been about that, and it's still not really about that. This culture war we're having, I believe, is about the principle at issue. There's another procedural sort of objection to the ERA. So when Phyllis Schlafly generated all of this fervor to resist the ERA, 5 states tried to withdraw or remove their ratifications. They tried to rescind. But there's no precedent to do this. So there's not, it's not clear that a state has the authority to do this.
I'm sure some would like to rescind the 14th Amendment.
You know, a couple states tried to. You may know this. A couple states tried to do that, and Congress didn't count their efforts to rescind. And so there's actually better evidence that it's Congress who will determine if these ratifications are counted at the end of the day. And you can imagine it would sort of be chaos if states could ratify, rescind, ratify, rescind.
Unstable forever.
And then the last 2, I mentioned that in the sermon that there's this argument that women shouldn't want equal rights. It'll actually be harmful to you to have equal rights. This was probably the most significant argument voiced at the hearing.
I almost threw my laptop out the window. Yes. They made a lot of hay with this to claim that affording equal rights would be harmful. And it really, let's see, I want to do what my law professors always taught me and try to construe this argument coherently. Like, what's the best version of this? I think the best version of this argument is, well, if you had full equality, you'd never be able to make any distinctions based on gender. And so that could be problematic if you want to consider special protections women might need, say if they're pregnant. But it's actually...
Nobody will hold the door for me anymore.
Right.
They'd have to get drafted.
What's that?
Women would be subject to the draft.
Yeah, that's another one. That's another one. This idea that women are enjoying special protections now that have been taken away. But in truth, a lot of legislation has changed over the intervening decades. So many of the protections that used to be more gendered are now gender neutral, like child support laws, social security laws. A lot of that framework has become more gender neutral. Even if you have equality, it would still be possible to retain private spaces for safe women's bathrooms. Bathrooms always feature really big in this. But 26 states have ERAs in their state constitutions. They all have bathrooms. So I think it's a bit of a red herring with the bathroom. And what else? Oh, the draft. There's actually been some case law that says if the draft were reinstated, women would be included now. So how about that?
Like Israel, right?
What's that?
Israel has a draft for women.
Israel is a draft for women. So, I'm looking at the clock. I mean, I'm giving just like headlines of all of this, right? But we've done a legal policy brief that has the more detailed explanation on each of these points. And that's on our website, justicerevival.org/ERA. If you're like, wait, this is a lot of information, which it is, and you want to, break down the specifics and see what's the sources we're citing, we've got all that on our website. The last one I'll just mention is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. They're one of the most visible and powerful ERA opponents. So that's one kind of source of the opposition. And then also some real Christian nationalist groups as well. But we researched this too and found that especially under the current court, the Roberts Court, there's very robust protections for religious freedom. And those aren't going anywhere. It's just a question of all people's rights being considered equally. Rights usually have to be considered alongside one another. And so we certainly want religious freedom to be protected, but we don't think that means needing to ignore the rights that women have too.
Are you guys a 501c3?
Yes. We are. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I promised to have a little time to talk. I'm going to grab a seat. The spirit is willing, but the body just needs a little rest.
Can you link to what people do before you quit?
Yeah.
Support. Then you can sit down.
Yeah. Okay, so things that you can do. One more piece that I haven't mentioned is a bill to clarify that the ERA has been ratified and to eliminate the timeline officially. And that bill has been passed by the House twice. And we believe that bill will get a vote in the Senate this Congress as early as a couple weeks from now. The Senate had the hearing on this bill recently. And so one thing that you could do is call your senator especially, and if they're, yeah.
And tell her to resign, sorry. I say that. Sorry.
Yeah. Assuming, so your senators are going to be in support, and so your request would be, we want you to talk about this bill, elevate it, advocate for it with your fellow members of the Senate. Like, thank you for supporting it, and now help us get it done. Second, we have an interfaith statement in support of the ERA, which 590 faith leaders have signed already, but we'd love to have more. So that's also on our website. And that's the other sort of action item. Think of it like a petition from faith leaders in favor of the ERA. So share that. I know Calvary has supported it. If you know other faith leaders or faith organizations, invite them to support it. Please follow us for real-time alerts on the issue. Justice Revival also has convened this Faith for ERA coalition. And if you know other faith organizations that would want to be a part of that, please talk to me about that. We'd love to keep growing that circle. There's also the ERA coalition that we're a part of, and that's another place that you can follow along for updates.
I would also add for the Generation Ratify, especially for younger folks. It's the new one that you guys shut down the freeway on rails with.
Yes.
Oh.
I just want to see, does anyone else have a question right now? And then I'll come back to you.
It's all right.
Yeah. Any questions?
Yeah, I'd like to know how we can get more people educated on this situation, because I was definitely one of those people who thought they knew already passed. I thought, oh yeah, okay. And it's very important, I think, right now that we make this keep moving ahead, since there's a little bit of momentum. So, is there information, or what's the best way to get the word out to other people about how important it is to?
Social media is one way, and we do some education on social media, and so does the ERA Coalition. So if you're using Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, you'll see a lot of educational posts from us and the ERA Coalition, and that's one resource. We'd like to do more sort of church engagements like this to have more conversations in churches, and that's I think an area of a lot of potential. And then we've also written articles, so tried to raise awareness through the media. For us, it's been religious media, but there's a lot that's being written. It doesn't, you're not gonna find it like on the New York Times or the Washington Post, mostly, a little bit like The Hill. But if you do a news alert for Equal Rights Amendment, you'll see a good bit of media that you can share. And then we've got a bunch of stuff on our website, obviously.
The bill you're talking about that's going to come before the Senate, is it going to require 3/4 vote or just 60, or what's the story on that?
Under the normal procedure, it would be 60 to overcome the filibuster. So it doesn't require the same 2/3 vote as the original amendment. And there are some other procedural options to maybe try other routes, but I think the most likely is that it'll need 60 votes.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Does this have Republican support in the Senate?
a little bit. Lisa Murkowski is a co-sponsor, and she's been a stalwart proponent of the ERA. Susan Collins is on board, and there's one Republican in the House, his name escapes me right now, who is a supporter but doesn't want to be known for it. But we need more Republican support.
Let's do one last question.
Yes, it's quite interesting vocabulary, amendment in terms of law. And German law never change. They never, even though different way interpreted of the law, but German law and Japanese law, even Korean law, never change. There is nothing, one of a law vocabulary, amendment.
Oh, really?
No.
Ah.
And even, they're quite interesting. Another thing is that you just quite interesting justice in terms of the Bible. we're talking about Deuteronomy and also 8th century prophet, Amos. And a lot of, his vocabulary identified the legal justice. So even though I'm wicked, they're one of the different vocabulary, legal vocabulary identify the biblical term or different way. But however, we're considering of justice, righteousness. They're quite interesting. Amos, 8th century prophet.
Yes.
Righteousness prophet.
Yes. No, it's such a different context we're in now, and how do we understand the way this word was used then and how we use it today? One thing I think is a common thread between those prophets and their calls for justice, and we saw it a little in today's story, that it meant inclusion, and as a result of inclusion, provision and security. It meant bringing in someone who had been left out. And we have, of course, a different context today, but I believe some of the best tools we have for accomplishing that goal is legal rights that empower those who've been left out or victimized, empower them and give them that same hope.
Thank you, Allie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a sign-up sheet, there's stuff you can take with you. I'm sure Allie doesn't want to take it back home, so if you can take it with you, that'd be great. Do you have any last words?
Just thanks for being here. Please do sign up, stay in touch. We're really grateful for your concern for this issue individually and again, collectively as a community.
Thank you for being here.
I have a target. We have our target.